is everyone?
Good, thank you. So welcome to this first roundtable, and thank you, Sandra, for inviting me to chair this roundtable. That is a specific roundtable on a sector that is the agri-food sector. So the agri-food sector is really specific. Obviously, it's linked to food security. It's a strategic sector that represents also a high share of labor in the world, and that is it's a sector that is particularly affected also by climate change. So these latest years, we saw a lot of disruption in this sector that affect particularly supply chain. First, the pandemic that exposed the vulnerabilities of this supply chain by interrupting flows and creating labor shortages, and also delaying shipments for really strategic goods. And then we also have the war in Ukraine that make a high destabilization on markets, in particular for fertilizer and grains, and that impact a lot of countries that rely on these imports. As I said, the food sector is also really sensitive to climate change. So we had the drought, fire, as we had in Marseille these little days, and floods that impact our production a lot. And on top of that, this latest month, what we'll just be discussed with a really amazing presentation of Kevin is the impact of protectionism and also geopolitical tensions that impacted particularly the agri-food supply chain. So this is the topic of this roundtable, the impact of all this disruption and what is happening now in the agri-food sector. But we will make a specific focus on the wine and spirit sector. This sector has a very specific and distinct demand patterns, because it's not a totally exact same thing to have alcohol and grains, for example, and it's also a high value offensive interest, in particular for France, but for Europe, in trade negotiation. And what is also specific is that this product, because it's a highly offensive sector for Europe, is particularly targeted by retaliation and by all tariffs, in particular in trade disputes. So today we have 4 panelists to discuss all these questions. First, we have Carla. Thank you, Carla, for being here. Carla Barisone, that is policy analyst in the Agri-food Trade and Market Division in Trade and Agriculture Directorate at OECD. So she will speak more about the broad view of resilience in the agri-food sector. And then we will dig more on the topic of the wine and spirit sector with Richard, that is online, that unfortunately he cannot join us today, but we are happy to see your face on the screen, Richard. So Richard is Grenfell-Hill, is chief economist at Diageo. And then we have Thierry Meyer, that is professor in economics in Sciences Po, a specialist on trade issues, one of the most famous researchers in trade in France. He usually speaks about automobile, but today will change his specialty. And then we have Cécile Rognoni. Thank you for being here. That she's public affairs director for Pernod Ricard in France. So just a few notes about that this roundtable will be on the Chatham House rules. So it means that participants are free to use information that is in this roundtable, but neither the identity of the affiliation of the speaker or other participant may be revealed. So I will begin with first round of questions. So I spoke about the different shocks that happened in the world and that particularly affected agri-food sector. So that test the resilience of supply chain and maybe change the strategic decision about sourcing, investment, market presence. So my first question will be for Carla. Based off what the OECD is doing currently, how do you assess the current state of resilience in global value chain in agriculture and agri-food sector for the moment? And what are the policy recommendations and structural adjustments you see as emerging? and how countries and companies can absorb all these shocks. So you have 8 minutes.
Okay. Thank you. So if you can put my slides.
So it's Carla presentation, the first one.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the question. I'm going to, while the slides are up, I'm just going to say how I'm going to structure my answer, which is by, first of all, framing what we mean by supply chain resilience. I'm going to touch on some trends that we've been seeing from the OECD perspective. And then I'm going to finish with what we do best, which is give some policy recommendations. So as you can see, oh, these look much better than when I submitted them. So as you can see, there's the definition at the top, which is supply chain resilience is the capacity of supply chain actors to prepare, plan for, absorb, and recover from adverse events, but also, and more importantly, in my opinion, adapt and transform in response for the future. Below that, you see these resilience, what are they called, factors. So these are 6 different ways, and this already ties into my suggestions for companies or for businesses. 6 different ways in which a company, if they wanted to improve their resilience, they could do so. So again, this is theoretical, and I'll be looking out for practical examples today of how companies become more resilient. So the first one is about increasing the diversity in supply chain nodes. So this is about avoiding choke points and by planning for multiple different pathways. Second one is connectiveness. This is related to the physical logistics and transport of products between the nodes. The third one is about redundancy. So this is on the ability of a firm to call upon its strategic reserves, stockpiles, or inventories. Visibility is about being able to see your supply chain structure, which is harder. It's easier said than done. And if there's an issue at one part, how quickly is that communicated along the supply chain? So this is related to early warning systems and communication. Then there's learning and adaptive planning. So this is about leveraging a crisis into an opportunity to become more resilient for the future. And then lastly, good governance structures and supply chain coordination, so information sharing. So like I said, it's a bit of a theoretical framework, but maybe it rings a bell if you're working on resilience in your businesses. And a disclaimer, or just to explain how the OECD works on this, we actually look at a food systems perspective to resilience. So we go beyond traditional supply chain thinking and try to integrate into our analysis also sustainability aspects, looking at inputs and also end of life, so food loss and waste. We integrate market trends, behaviors, so consumer and producer behaviors, and then most importantly, put supply chains in the context of policy frameworks. So if I go a bit beyond the remit of supply chains, that's why. And next is looking at the different shocks that agri-food supply chains have been facing. They can fit into one of 5 categories, in our opinion. The first one is extreme weather events, animal disease, so that's things like African swine fever, food safety concerns, so mad cow disease, socioeconomic system shocks, so that's something that we're more familiar with pandemics and wars, and also poor food distribution policies. And then lastly, trade restrictions, which we'll cover in the second part of the panel. So to be sticking to time, I'm just going to touch on 3 things of trends of resilience that we're seeing. The first one, like time and time again, we've seen the role of international trade as mitigating price shocks, and it's a really important risk pooling mechanism, in our opinion. A second one is there's a debate around market structure, so what market concentration is best for resilience. There's 2 different sides to the debate, and it's unclear which one is better. Obviously, probably in the middle is just right, but we can go into that debate in the Q&A if you'd like. And then the last one is we've had this resilient supply chain forum last month, and it was a similar kind of mix of different actors and businesses to discuss about disruptions and enabling conditions for resilience. And one of the main things that came out of that was, and we had a session on logistics and transport. The main discussion was moving from this just-in-time supply chain management to a just-in-case style. I'm not sure if people are familiar with that terminology, but it essentially means moving from a more lean and kind of bare minimum and buffer stock, like lower buffer stocks, to one that indeed you have more buffer stocks, which in turn comes with higher holding costs and a different set of investments, but that's the main trend we're seeing post-COVID. Okay, and just to conclude with some policy recommendations, we're very aware that firms and farmers and businesses are the main risk bearers and are the main ones implementing any sorts of plans of resilience. But we're a member-facing organization, so we work more on government recommendations. So the first point is that we recommend governments to deal with the risk that the private sector cannot handle alone or as individuals. So that some examples of that include responsible business conduct or creating the right incentives or more incentives to work on sustainability. And other examples include investing in bigger infrastructure projects or stakeholder coordination and early warning systems that apply sector-wide. Other things we recommend is, of course, relying on the role of open markets and trade, the consistency and harmonization of regulation is another one that's come up a lot. And ultimately, we try to create the evidence base to prove to governments that trade restrictive behaviors are not helpful for resilience efforts. So when it comes to businesses, I would refer, like I said, we're not an expert on this, but I would refer to the resilience factors I started with in a theoretical place, but it is really dependent on the sector capacity and the issues that are facing a supply chain. But in terms of what we're seeing is relevant for both of them, is that there's a lot of effort on foresighting and stress testing, especially at the EU level recently. Also contingency planning, early warning systems, and vertical coordination. So these are a bit all buzzwords, but I'm happy to go in deeper on each of them later. And just my overarching message that I want to leave to the rest of the panel is that I think our work has shown that on a global level, agri-food supply chains are relatively resilient, more so than we sometimes give them credit for. And there's a consistent and stable share of traded goods returning to pre-shock volumes and prices. So, things might be changing now, and we'll see how in the next few months how things develop post-tariffs. But that's the message I want to leave with, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the business perspective on each of these issues. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla. I think this conclusion about the resilience of the agri-food sector is really interesting, because it's one of the specificity we saw during COVID, that at the end it was the most resilient sector as compared to the other. So thank you for giving an overview about this agri-food supply chain. Now, with the three other panelists, we will focus more on the spirit and alcohol sector. First with Richard Grenfell-Hill. So Richard, again, thank you for being here online. The question I will ask is, from your perspective at Diageo, how this global disruption affects the wine and spirit sector specifically, and what trend did you observe for the demand side, the evolution of demand and the prices, strategies and dynamic? So you have 8 minutes. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, I think it's been a tough 2 years from a sort of a wine and spirits perspective. Inflation, energy crisis, wars, both hot and cold, have not really helped sort of consumption. But actually, we've avoided a global recession so far, touch wood, and consumers and economies have been more resilient than what sort of economists and forecasts have thought they would be. And I think this goes down to a tight labour market. Despite all the noise going on about imminent recessions in the US, etc., the US economy remains extremely strong. Near full employment. Indeed, even in the EU, I was looking at the labour stats for 2024, and employment is at record highs. I mean, you just have to look at Spanish unemployment to see that levels are back to places last seen in the early 2000s before the financial recession. And this does mean that wage growth has not collapsed. Wage growth has helped household spending. So we've not seen sort of the behaviours you would expect if there was a recession. And indeed elsewhere, I mean, I look, because I cover globally, places like Brazil, sort of all forecasts and economists have been very pessimistic about countries like that. And in fact, economies there have sort of always been surprising to the upside over the last couple of years, meaning that consumption there has been really good. What does this mean for Scotch? Well, there was a rather large party as restrictions were lifted. And what we're doing is we're this hangover, which is not surprising because if anyone remembers Peloton or any other sort of press forecasts of things at the time, everyone was sort of talking about growth forever and not realizing that things go in peaks and troughs. So by way of Scotch, last year was the first year of falls in volumes of exports, and in fact in 2024 Scotch whisky exports were 5.4 billion, about 800 million lower than in 2022, but we should remember they were still 500 million higher than in 2019, which to me is about a growth rate of about 2%, which is slightly lower than what was there before the pandemic, but still kind of like, when I'm looking at forecasting, in a reasonable assumption of where it would have been if there hadn't been the pandemic. And it wasn't all bad, actually. I've done the numbers, and in fact, those exports could have been a lot worse in 2024. 100 countries did see falls in Scotch exports, but actually 88 countries did see increases. Not enough to offset losses, but still sort of positive. So it was quite good that even though after the pandemic everything went up, that way, things have slowly been correcting with business cycles moving to different speeds. Of course, it's not been equal, and it's APAC that has probably been the most concern, mainly because China has not bounced back. And that shouldn't be surprising considering the scale of lockdown restrictions, the fact that the government didn't give out subsidies or money as they did in, say, the UK. And also there's a wealth shock as well, with property prices falling. So obviously consumption wouldn't return to where it was if households have been feeling a squeeze on wages and wealth. But that's 2024. Looking at 2025, it does look like the post-pandemic party and the overstocking has been exhausted. Scotch returned to growth of 2.4% in January to April. There was a 16% fall in EU exports in 2024, and that has actually moved to 3.3% growth of UK Scotch into the EU. Which is quite positive. I mean, it is unequal. It's France, Germany, Spain driving the growth. There are falls in Italy and Netherlands. So, there's still causes where there might be overstocks that still need to be sort of moved through. And then, of course, Latin America continues to be strong. And actually, it's not just volatility. There is restocking in places like Mexico, where they had a very bad year last year, and there are signs that their consumption is returning. But of course, the worry is that APAC, although there are signs that the pace of the contraction is slowing, and probably some of the overstock that was there is finally being exhausted. So I've talked about Scotch. I should now talk about what I've been observing in order to sort of think forward. As an economist, we're always being asked what the future holds. So my first thing would be, don't believe what the press say all the time. I think I might have said that about Peloton, about people never returning to flying again, which is a myth, and also some of the things that the press is saying around alcohol consumption. So the first one is probably Gen Z not drinking. That is not true, and in fact, there's been quite a bit of research done recently to show that that is not well, that is false, and in fact it's been going up. The IWSR have recently published a report on this and showing that that has been creeping up. There's also I've been looking at US household income data, and that has been showing that it's actually millennials and Gen Z who have been sort of boosting up consumption. And it's not been the baby boomers whose consumption has been remaining pretty static all the time. There's one on the death of premiumization. Now, I feel sometimes that premiumization, and I have to keep on telling that to stakeholders in the business, that premiumization isn't all about luxury goods. It's more about sort of affordable luxury, so to speak. It's a bit like consumers in emerging economies moving from domestic products to a brand such as Smirnoff, which is seen as a higher, better quality, slightly higher priced. It's about consumers moving from homebrew, which we see in quite a lot of economies, into formal market consumption, be it beer or spirits. And I have to think about how there's still a lot of opportunities out there. When I was in Argentina and it was opening up in 2016, 2017, everyone was welcoming and drinking Smirnoff because it had been absent from the market for 20 years. But when it came in, everyone was, up trading from local products into Smirnoff. And then the final one is always question the data, because when people talk about alcohol consumption and they take the official figures, I would have to say that the IWSR data, 20% of all that consumption is from China. About 5 years ago, that was 30% of all data from consumption. And what people forget is that does actually influence what the global consumption looks like with formal figures. You also have to double check that there is a large informal market, which doesn't show signs of disappearing, and also that sometimes the IWSR doesn't put volume data in. I note in Indonesia they miss out quite a lot of domestic production that you can see in excise receipts, but you don't actually see in the numbers that say the number crunchers or financial experts look at if they're just looking at IWSR data. And finally, my last point will be on inflation and pricing. Again, it's always forget what the press is saying. I always feel you've got to tell people that things do not go up linearly. It's quadratic. I cite during the energy crisis in 2022, people talking about a 20 or 25 pound pint. That's obviously not going to happen because consumers have a point where they cannot afford it. And if there's overproduction or oversupply, then price has to come down to meet those expectations. And that is probably what we've been seeing within the spirits and wine market. I draw myself to Champagne and Bordeaux, where in Champagne, it's not been a rosy ride. I know the press talk about Champagne being a celebratory drink, but I always quote Napoleon that in victory you deserve it and in defeat you need it. And that actually it's probably pricing that has more to do with it. When you increase prices by 30, 40%, but consumers are still thinking about the price of eggs or other commodities in 2019 terms, you are going to have a problem. And it's the same in Bordeaux, where even En Primeur this year went with pricing 25% lower than previous years. People are still thinking, well, why should I bother when I can pick up stock that's already existing cheaper elsewhere? So my final rule on pricing is probably look at the 2019 price of things, work out what that inflation rate would have been to over 6 years to now, and then you've probably got a fairly accurate picture of where consumers are thinking of where pricing should be. So hopefully I've kept within 8 minutes, and that's me done.
Thank you very much, Richard. It was really enlightening. It's really interesting to see your perspective, and maybe we will have time to go deeper during the Q&A afterwards. Now we will see another perspective that is from the more about production side with Thierry Meyer. So. Thierry, in your recent research, so as I said, you're usually more a automobile guy, but you made a research on beer and spirit industry. So what can you tell us about this industry from an economic point of view? What is the specificity? And what did you observe during your research, in particular about the multinational acquisition and the impact on consumers?
Yeah, thank you. So if you can put the slides on. So yeah, it's going to be very complementary with respect to what's just been said. So I'm gonna focus on the supply side, and let me point you to several challenges. First, it's a very specific sector. The way I understand it, as a pure academic economist, okay, not a specialist of the industry from the inside. There's super strong comparative advantage in that, of course, and with historical actors, it's a highly symbolic cultural good. As Charles was saying, it's going to actually, it's so symbolic that it's used in trade policy as I'm going to punish you on this because it's going to raise the stakes, and we're going to talk about that maybe a little bit later. It's highly regulated. First, let me talk about this recent trend, which is the massive concentration patterns that we observe. So it's good that I have, people from Diageo and Pernod Ricard here, because I'm going to talk a lot about Diageo and Pernod Ricard, and that may be a good interactions. So here is a table from this recent paper that Charlotte was mentioning. And the paper is called Global Giants and Local Star, which I think we stole from Diageo website, actually, because that's typically, that's on their website. So those are brands owned by Diageo, and you can see global giants that, like Smirnoff was talked about. It's the #2 spirit in the world, originates from Russia, sold in 62 markets, and it's a very old brand, bought in 1987, but it's a very old product. And all those things are actually very old, and they've been bought by Diageo over time. They acquired those brands. And there's another set of brands that actually owned by Diageo, which are local stars. Okay, and local stars can be, for instance, this Yeni Raki, which is #1 in Turkey, and only sells in 3 markets. Actually, those are local because you see the number here. They're really 3-1, 3-1, etc. It's like they're really like top beverages on their own markets. And what I'm going to argue, what we argue in this paper, is that the strategy of those groups was to combine those global giants with local stars, buying those local stars in order to gain market share in those different markets, and build those moguls firms. Okay, and that's very different from carbonates and all those things. Oh yeah, well, there's a different color from what I expected, but that's good. I hope you can see something. So this is what's really impressing. So first, this is a sector with fantastic data. So that's always good for us economists, and also so much action. So this is beer and this is spirits. So since we are spirits, let's do spirits. This is the number of brands that Pernod Ricard and Diageo and Bacardi and other firms own. And so the numbers here is like 150 to 100. And so when this massive merger here brings the number of brands from less than 200 to 250. So they buy buckets of brands and massive buckets of brands. And so those firms have gigantic numbers of brands on any standard. If you think about cars, this incompatible industry I also work with, this is really has nothing to do. Those brands are just numerous. And this is 8 to 10% market share in the world. If you think about AB InBev, the beer giants, they actually have 25% of the world market. And in many markets, they have actually 80, 85, 90% of the market. So it's really a concentration that you almost don't see in any other industry. So that's a major feature of that sector, which makes it super interesting for us. I gave the precise details here about those mergers. Okay, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about, as was said before, the critical thing that we're going to see about the second major policy orientation, and we talk later, is the trade wars. Okay, so those beverages are going to get really hit by trade wars. And one of the examples is that when Trump decided to do the steel and aluminum, the European Commission said, okay, then we're going to hit your whiskey. We're going to hit your export of whiskey. And immediately Trump said, okay, so then we're going to hit cognac and everything else by 50%. And so the whole issue, and I'll try to get back later maybe on that when we talk about tariff policy, is that is how to estimate those elasticities in order to predict what's going to happen in terms of those tariffs. And another feature that is really going to be really important is the impact of quality, and I'll get back later to that. But I want to also show you one other thing, is that in beer and spirits, so here beer and spirits here. What we have is that the global giants, actually in beer and spirits, hold very large amounts of the market share, okay, and an even larger in terms of value. So that's really the single market. The ones that sell in the single market, they're 81%, for instance, in spirits. They sell only in one market. They do 51% of the value. And so when you combine those guys with those global giants, it's going to essentially bring you to a very, very large market share. And we can use the model to predict what is the markup and look at the impact for the consumers of those mergers. And the paper is about that. And on some markets, the impact is really big. And also it helps to rationalize the competition policy, because the other thing that the market structure regenerates is that some of those, especially in beer, some of those mergers have been accompanied with a competition policy divestments, some not. And the paper actually shows what would have happened as a counterfactual if they had not. And the consumer price change is about 20%. So the impact of the competition policy here is really very large in some countries, and that gives you an idea. So I'm going to stop here because Charlotte tells me that I'm not allowed to speak about tariffs yet. So that I'm going to stop about this.
Keep it that for later. Thank you. Thank you very much for this. In fact, it was really complementary with Richard's presentation. So we will finish this first round of question with Cécile Rognoni from Pernod Ricard. So my question will come back more on the disruption and how the uncertainty reshape the approach to international operation at Pernod Ricard. How do you manage this increase in uncertainty? And did you do some strategic shift, for example, in particular in supply chain design? So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be in front of you today. Pernod Ricard is the second largest company spirit of the world, just after Diageo, and with the strong will to become the first company. We have grown by the acquisition of major brands like Martell, Chivas, Jameson, Absolut, Havana Club. Stability is a core value for company. But unfortunately, insecurity is everywhere. We work in 150 countries with high visibility product. We have to face issues about ethics, health, logistics, regulation, geopolitics. When we think about major crises, Our first idea is about COVID, because it struck the entire world very suddenly with very little warning. And for us, it has an important business impact because the closure border and the shutdowns of bar and restaurant had this impact because 20% of our products are sold in this place. The question today is not anymore to know if a crisis will happen, but rather when, where, and with what ripple effect. At Pernod Ricard, resilience is part of both family and company history. Paul Ricard has never gave up in front of adversity. During the war, the prohibition of spirit has been announced. He reinvented himself as a farmer in Camargue and brought all his employees with him. In 1956, another example, during the Canal de Suez crisis, there were no petrol anymore to deliver our product into bars and restaurants. He organized the Caravan of Thirst and delivered his pastis with camels through the streets of Paris. Every obstacle has been an opportunity to grow and to invent something new. The first risk I would like to highlight is health risk. As any company we sell consumer product, we have to face this health risk, and even a minor quality issue can seriously damage the image of our brands or the entire company. That is why we try to make our best to minimize this risk. People have been specially recruited, head of compliance, head of quality, head of safety, to be sure that our production process meets the higher standard. We have also implemented numerous audits, and we have developed a software tool to flag and track any potential quality issue. When it comes to health risk, vigilance is absolutely essential. Another growing source of uncertainty is climate and environmental risk. We are very connected with agriculture. Our production depends on soil quality, on weather condition, water availability, and we have to face wildfire in Australia and declining yields in Champagne due to dryness and due to wine frost damage. To address this challenge, we have subscribed an insurance that covers climate-related losses, and we have also invested in a robust environmental strategy, which is fully aligned with Paris Agreement objective. Concretely, that means reducing our water usage, progressing in agriculture regenerative, and helping our partner wine growers to adopt sustainable practices. Then we have lastly conducted climate scenario analysis for the decade ahead and developed tailored response strategies for each potential trajectory. The third risk I would like to highlight is illicit trade and counterfeiting. It may be less visible than health and environmental risk, but for a company like ours, it is as dangerous. There is an issue of health because counterfeiting products can be toxic and can cause death. From an economic standpoint, there are significant losses. And the last risk is about the substitution to have the genuine product which could be replaced by poor quality copy sold through illegal channel. That's why at Pernod Ricard we have a dedicated team who work full-time on this subject. They work close to the local production with our distributors. They work with secret agents and with public authorities, for example, ministries and custom. We had a recent example with counterfeiting in Armenia. It had been swiftly resolved. We have wished out the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he raised the subject at the highest level during a ministerial visit. We try to be forward-looking, to anticipate, and to be collaborative. I have also a risk of political uncertainty. I will be very short because we will talk it after. But one thing which have a link with CMA-CGM is the geopolitical risk on transportation on our product. Recently, the Red Sea became too dangerous, and we had to consider new shipping routes. And more recently, the Strait of Hormuz may be blocked due to the conflict in Iran. To conclude, these 4 types of risk shows that the risks are increasingly frequent, and we must be ready for them. That is why at Pernod Ricard, our 2 words are anticipation and preparation. We prefer to talk about risk than crisis.
Thank you very much, Cécile. Thank you for your presentation. That was also really complementary with the other. So I think it gave us a quite comprehensive vision of all the challenges that are faced by the agri-food supply chain, in particular in the wine and spirit industry. So in a second round of question, I would like to focus more on something we already spoke about this morning with Kevin, a really interesting presentation, that is the impact of protectionism. So we saw that the protectionist policies gain around the world, and the agri-food sector is always at the center of trade disputes. I don't know, maybe Kevin will be able to speak more about that, but it's from a historical point of view, I assume that food products are usually the ones that are the more targeted, and it's what we are seeing today. There is not only tariffs, but also sanctions, retaliatory measures, and it's really a recurring challenges. So in this second part, I would like my panelists to focus more on this specific challenge. So maybe we'll do as previously with Carla, that speak more about in general in the agri-food sector, how tariffs and other protectionist measures affect strategies in the agri-food sector. And in particular, I would like to ask you whether you notice the trend toward reshoring or friendshoring, because it's what we usually heard in the agri-food supply chain, or what you can tell us about that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I do think it's really important that we're talking about this for the agri-food sector. So I'm going to, again, unpack it in 3 different steps. So I'll talk about trade restrictions more generally while the slides are going up, as a source of disruption. So not only tariffs, then I'll touch on tariffs, and then I'll finish on the reshoring question. So at the OECD, we work on trade restrictions, and we monitor the policy developments of that very closely. And in a way, we contribute to resilience in this mechanism. So there's a G20 agricultural market information system, and it means that we track 4 staple crops of wheat, corn, rice, and soybeans. So these are more important for food security. And we basically monitor export and import restrictions. So for the non-trade experts, I'll just quickly explain. For export restrictions, they include export bans, quotas, licensing, and levies. And these are often used in the face of rapidly rising food prices. And then on import restrictions, there's import duties, which are tariffs. So tariffs kind of fit under that. Also import bans, quotas, and price floors. And these tend to be used over some safety concern, food safety concern, or to protect domestic producers from competition. So more often the latter, let's say. I won't go into examples of each, but an overarching point I wanted to make is that protectionism and trade restriction is often an instinct that that governments reach for in times of difficulties. And I think it's important because we try to build the evidence base that this is not good for resilience and it's not as effective as they think, sometimes counterintuitive, and also results in longer recovery and price stabilization. So that's the first point. So touching on tariffs, since the US is a member of the OECD, I can only say so much. First, because of that, but then also because we don't do live analysis on the impact on agricultural trade just yet. But beyond that, I also can't talk too much about it just because, as we can tell, it's extremely a bit all over the place to say. It's still not clear exactly what tariffs apply on what commodity, on what country, from when until when, depending on what. So my simple answer is just too soon to tell. We can imagine it's not going to be good, but it's just too soon to tell. That being said, I can point to this report done by IFPRI. I really recommend reading it if you care about this question. And they conduct this multi-region, multi-sector CG model and an ex-ante analysis on what these retaliatory tariffs, these initial ones announced, would look like. And in summary, it suggests a 3.3% of global ag trade contraction. And this number goes up to 4.7% in the case of tit for tat, so mutual retaliation to the retaliatory tariffs. So it's not looking good. If you're interested in the Q&A, I can talk a bit more about some of the findings and which countries are maybe more at risk, and also what commodities. Again, a point on this is that not only are the tariffs important, but the reaction to the tariffs that's something that we can control and advise on a little bit. And so that is really going to determine the real impacts. And so will countries start to sign trade agreements to appease and prevent the tariffs, like potentially, arguably, the UK is doing? Will we see increase in general on restrictive trade policies, or will they flat out retaliate with tariffs back? And a question, for example, is will the EU use its anti-coercion instrument? And lastly, moving on to the reshoring and friendshoring question, I'm going to refer to two studies. The first one is on the screen. The second one is not, but it's the first one is titled International Trade in the Wake of Multiple Shocks. So it came out in 2023, and it came out very clearly that the data to date does not indicate significant evidence of reshoring and friendshoring. So this is in general, and this is including manufacturing sectors, which, in my opinion, this terminology pops up even more than for agri-food. So that's my first answer. And it found that the physical distance of imports increase, but the geopolitical distance has remained stable. Just one nuance is that it did use UN voting patterns as a proxy, which is not the perfect indicator, but anyway. So that's one point. I'm sure there are examples and individual cases of it happening and businesses weighing up whether to do it or not. I can talk about an example. I'm not sure if I have the time to, but okay. I have one example. It's a bit of a specific one, but there is at the moment this kind of tomatoes war going on in Florida and in the US. They've set a 17% anti-dumping levies on Mexican tomatoes, which makes up 70% of the US market. So all of this point is to say that for a lot of commodities, and especially for fruits and vegetables, there's a reason that agricultural trade and 20% of all calories cross borders. So production is specialized, it's imported and exported for a reason. And so to question it is, in my opinion, reshoring is not super likely for a lot of raw commodities. That being said, it could be different for processing or processed goods, and for maybe inputs like fertilizer. So there is differences depending on what you're looking at. That being said, this whole business weighing up the decision, there is also sacrifices or trade-offs to be made on quality, price, variation, what you're willing to have on, what the minimum you're willing to have on your market is. So So yes, so that's the kind of first part of answering that question. There was a second study I want to highlight, which is called the Supply Chain Resilience Review. This came out a lot more recently, and this basically did an analysis on what, under a scenario of aggressive reshoring, what would the impacts be? And the finding was that under these localized supply chain scenario, we would see up to a decrease of 18% of global trade. Like 18% of global trade is like really, I'd have to say, it's massive. And this also could lead to up to 12% reduction in GDP globally. And the number for France was 5% of GDP reduction under this scenario. So it's something that we just kind of caution of, first of all, also giving this a lot of attention when it's not happening, but also from following it and seriously, implementing it. So that's a bit of my personal opinion on top of OECD work. So I just want you to bear that in mind, but thank you.
Wait. Thank you very much, Carla, for sharing your perspective and also for highlighting the fact that agri-food sector is really heterogeneous, and it's different to speak about tomatoes or alcohol or something else. And that this question about reshoring or friendshoring, of course, depend also on the product, whether they are perishable, how the markets are concentrated, etc. So thank you very much. So after this broad discussion about impact of protectionism on agri-food, we will come back to the sector of wine and spirit. So we'll come back to Richard. So as we said, and Thierry said before, the wine and spirit sector is particularly affected by protectionist measures in recent years. There is targeted tariffs, other trade barriers. From your perspective at Diageo, Richard, how have these measures impact trade flows, pricing, and also strategic decision within your industry? Can you share some perspective on that? Do you observe shift in export strategy, for example, but also in sourcing or market prioritization?
Yes, I mean, that's an interesting one. I mean, we've been working on trade barriers and tariffs since Brexit and the first Trump administration. And in fact, we were hit by the Boeing Airbus dispute in 2019, 2020. So had full sort of how did we implement sort of strategies to deal with that? In that case, it was a bit of forward stocking. Amusingly, 2020 was also the year COVID hit. So there was some unusual trade. So where we thought things like Bailey's would have volume drops because of increase in pricing, actually there was the COVID effect, which meant that sales increased as people stayed at home and drank Bailey's whilst baking cakes. So that was the unusual side effect of tariffs implemented during COVID. So we've dusted everything off for Trump too, and not surprising. I think I've got some books here that the Americans have always been trying to implement a border adjustment tax for as long as we can remember. The sort of we've modelled out the 10%, the 20%, the 50%, and what the impact was. We'd also looked at what the impact was of tequila from Mexico, and of course we have a very large Canadian whiskey called Crown Royal, which is big in Texas of all places. We've sort of dusted that off and looked at the perspectives. Obviously we've got Taco Trump, so what he says one moment changes the next. So what we've been doing this time round is having to basically sit back and wait about a week before we can make any decisions for what we can do. Unfortunately, it's the knock-on effects into other countries, say APAC, for instance, that is depressing, because obviously in places like Vietnam, where they've been hit quite substantially by tariffs, that will have an impact on jobs and consumption. However, I mean, I should say that this is just unusual. Tariffs is just unusual for developed economies. I mean, we have decades of dealing with markets where there are quite large trade restrictions. For instance, Ecuador, which used to be a very big market for Johnny Walker, implemented tariffs in the 2000s to protect domestic industry. So we saw volumes of Johnny Walker collapse into Ecuador. But amusingly, it was basically the government that lost out on the revenue there, because there are other informal economies where there are flows that sort of circumnavigate these kind of restrictions. So yes, as an industry, we are used to these protectionist measures, be it tariffs, but also because we are highly regulated, we also see the impact of taxation, excessive taxation, or like licensing or advertising or various other things which can threaten trade flows. And in this case, like I said about the informal market, we have to remind governments that some measures can be counterproductive, and they can lose revenue from taxation, they can lose revenue from jobs growth, and various other things, particularly if there are low levels of business compliance and a functioning informal market. I recall a conversation with the IMF mission to Mozambique a while back, where they did not understand that it was easier to buy spirits through the informal market than it was to buy spirits through the formal market, and they sort of didn't quite get that. But that is the fact in some countries. A highly functioning informal market can actually do speedier deliveries than actually the formal market. And this is not just linked to developing economies. We did a lot of work with Belgium, which increased excise taxes by 44% in 2015, expecting a massive jump in revenue, which didn't happen. And the main reason was that obviously countries or governments sometimes think of themselves in isolation, without thinking that, say, in Belgium, people could jump into cars and drive to Germany, France, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, all of which have lower excise levels and with lower pricing of spirits, and purchase them there. In this case, it's not us who is losing out on the revenue or the sales. It's the government, as these consumers were buying our own products elsewhere, but not within Belgium. But so we're always pointing out the informal market and those sort of things with governments and restrictions to try and at least make that case. But on trade itself, I mean, this year has been quite fascinating with some perspectives of sort of opportunities that are coming out from trade. Because whereas you have the US implementing targets and tariffs and things like that, there's almost been a change in response to some other larger economies who've said, well, if they're becoming restrictive, we actually might want to open up and look like that. And in this case, the free trade agreement with India has been amazing. I never thought it was going to happen. I've been modelling India and free trade agreements and tariff reduction since about 2018, and every year when there was a JETCO, on a Friday morning, I'd be asked to update all the numbers and get them through to the sort of the various ministries in order to make the case. And this time round, it was actually very surprising to see the tariff reductions to being halved and then going to 40% over 10 years. And in this case, it's a real opportunity in India because it's got a very fast growing middle class. The population is huge. I mean, part of the way of Johnny Walker is that the joke is that people think that India drinks more Johnny Walker than is produced globally, which tells you a little bit about the size of the informal market, but also the size of opportunity for Scotch into India, where you can actually increase sort of market access for formal produced products rather than the informal counterfeit produced products. So that's been really good, and actually that has set a precedent for some other sort of trade agreements. I look at Thailand, where last year, for some surprising reason, they reduced tariffs on wine from the EU from 60% to 0%, and this has actually had a benefit. I think their despite that, so naturally there was rather a lot of stock in there already, which needed shifting through. But this year there has been a positive uplift for wine from the EU into Thailand of about 30%. So that has been a positive aspect, and I think we're working on trying to get tariffs reduced on spirits in order to show that they can increase excise receipts for the government. And then this has also been positive because in Indonesia there's been a change in cultural shifts. So previously Indonesia has an import tariff of 150%. And it's always been the cultural issues of being a large Muslim economy that has meant that we haven't been able to engage. But when I was out there in May, we were able to see government, and they were willing and open to talk about this. And the cultural side has been sort of sidelined to the fact that because they only collect about 13% tax to GDP, they need to raise revenue, and this is one of those easy wins for them. And that actually comes down to another opportunity. My final sort of opportunity is that actually the Middle East, this change in cultural perceptions is actually sort of quite positive for the alcohol market. And I have to note that one of the strongest countries of growth for Scotch in 2024 was the UAE, which grew by 11% and is now the 11th largest Scotch market in the world. So I'll end there, and also with the usual caveats as an economist that forecast can and will change depending on probably what Trump does next. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So, in fact, if I make a summary, you of agreements with other countries, but also change in culture and opening of markets is say that it's not only the Trump administration is not such a big deal because there is a lot of other opportunities for the sector. That's right?
Yeah, that's right.
So now I will turn to Thierry. So Thierry, I stopped you last time because I didn't want you to go to over on about the protectionism question. So I will come back and let you finish your talk about what is the impact of this protectionism we see in this sector. And I have another question. Maybe I don't know if you prepare to answer to it, but do you think this measure is a temporary political shocks, or is it reshaping long-term structure of international trade? If you can say maybe one word about that afterwards.
So I think I would be as pessimistic as Kevin before. I think it's here to last. Now, what is the ultimate level that this thing is going to end? We're not sure, but I think the U.S. really has switched its views of what is the appropriate level of its protection, and there's very little support in the political scene in the US to go back to some sort of free trade. So, and there was very little support by either the Obama or the Biden administration to go back to multilateralism in general. And so I would be pretty, I think we better get prepared for long-lasting tariffs in general. So we better understand how it works and how to estimate their effects. Tariff elasticities are essentially own price elasticities, which means that you raise your price by 10%, 25%, whatever it means, and how much do you reduce the consumption. In spirits and beer, so I've worked on that, and many people have worked on those elasticities. The spirits, beer, wine elasticities are actually surprisingly large. If you think that people love variety and are very sensitive to specific beverages, etc., you should expect relatively low price elasticities, but they actually are about 4, 2 at the minimum, independently of how you do it. In Mirto is here, so in IO, very fancy methods using national markets, or even sometimes very and with very sophisticated demand structures, we get about 4. in much less sophisticated trade literature using tariffs, that's the advantage, you get multi-country, we get something that is actually not so far. Okay, so that's a very strong reaction. 1% increase, 4% reduction in demand. So that's a very big thing. So we estimate this using tariffs. Actually, there's a very recent paper, there's a series of papers that, for those of you who are interested in alcohol, there's an association of wine economists that actually meets every year. It's a very good conference. They have tasting, etc. And it's very serious with Aschenfelter, with like very, very high ranking economists in the profession that actually member. Kim Anderson, an Australian, is a distinguished member of that society. And he worked very recently, actually, that's like a few weeks, a month ago. He worked on evaluating with a global general equilibrium sort of a model of beer, spirits, and wine. So that's really exactly what we're talking about. And the US is 16% of the consumption of wine, 30% of beer, 8% of spirits. So it's a big market. It's not, dominant, but it's very big. So it matters what they do. So they have several scenarios. So the scenario is, okay, 20% hike in tariff on US imports on alcoholic beverages, all of them. The second is 20% on everybody. Okay, so of course, this is the impact on annual value of wine exports to the US and the rest of the world. This is one table of their paper. And that the first thing you can see, of course, is that the EU scenario, EU hits EU, but EU actually is able to export some of it to the world, to the rest of the world. Okay, and that's the mechanism in those general equilibrium models, is that you hit the EU producers, they have to reduce their price in order to accommodate this. Therefore, they become more competitive on the rest of the world markets. Okay, of course, it doesn't compensate. The total is bad for the EU, and the other guys gain. The other guys gain in the US, of course, but they lose in the rest of the world because the EU is such a massive exporter of alcohol in general. So that sort of gives you interesting industry level equilibrium dynamics that I find quite interesting. If they hit everybody else, actually the EU is still the most damaged because the EU is so dominant. And then there's retaliation, and then there's some uncertainty that brings down demand, -2% of demand. So there's a very scenario, but the picture essentially, if we go into a tariff war, is going to be quite damaging in terms of those flows. I mean, not that damaging. This is in US millions. So we're talking 600 millions or 700 millions, and that's not a big part of the trade flows, but still it's gonna be felt. One thing that in those aggregate data, you can't really see, micro granular thing that really is important in that specific industry. One thing that is really important in that industry is that quality matters. So this Association for Wine Economists, one of their obsession is whether terroir, some French invention, matters. So where you grow the stuff, the quality of the soil, etc., whether it matters for quality. So they try to extract with hedonic prices what are the conditions. It matters that except French economists, nobody finds that terroir works. It's only climate. But we got a lot of people working for the Ministry of Agriculture that do that. So here's a paper, a set of different graphs this is a paper on Champagne that we did a long time ago, but still tells us some interesting stuff. So wine and Champagne, wine in general is great because its quality is observable in the sense that you have those guidebooks, and now you have the websites that each and every guy that sells champagne has a star, 1 to 5 star, 1 being bad, 5 being great. And you can see, for instance, let me give you this picture, the number of markets that are reached by those exporters. If you're 1 star, okay, the worst quality, which is here, So it really is not a lot of, this is like 50%, this is 5%. So only 5% of the 1-star reach more than 10 markets. But here's the 5-star, you start at 20. So everybody that is a 5-star sells to 20 markets. And then you got those guys that sell to essentially everybody in the world. So Kiribati, a small island in the Pacific, has one exporter by France, only one, and that's Moët & Chandon, and that's the only one. So high quality really matters here. And it matters in 2 dimensions. It matters in terms of high prices. So quality is cost, but quality is also higher value and higher willingness to pay. So that's high prices. And overall, if you look at the values, high quality 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you see at the values, and that is the benefit to cost ratio of quality, and it's always positive, you see. So quality always pays in this industry, in the sense that it gains you more revenues than it raises costs. And so raising quality actually pays. Why is it important in terms of protectionism? It's because those high quality firms are special. And so they will respond to taxes. So Diageo and Pernod Ricard and those big companies, they will have high quality products. And that makes them big. And they will react differently to tariffs than the smaller producers. That's what the theory tells us. And that's what the empirics tells us also. In a standard trade model, you won't have that. But in any more elaborated trade model, you would have the price elasticity being specific and specific to a firm, which means that large firms face lower price elasticities, which means that they have higher markups. That's what most IO model will give you. And large firms are also going to adjust more on prices and less on quantities. Because they are large, high quality or low cost, therefore large, they will be more able to move their markups and less on quantities. They have to less adjust on high quantity, and those high quality firms will tend to be larger. All in all, we should expect large change in markups, low change in volumes for high quality, and for large firms in general, or large brands. And those guys make 75% of all exports. So if you want to think micro, and say it's like high quality protects you from tariffs, yes. High quality protects you from tariffs, partly. I mean, not fully, but partly. So that's, I think, interesting for the micro aspect. At the macro level, we need to take this into account, because since those guys are so big, they actually have a reduced reaction. So they take this partly in their markups, which means that the overall employment, wage, etc., impacts are going to be lowered than if you assumed that everybody would react with an elasticity of 4. Those guys have a lower elasticity. So and that's a paper by Chen and Juvenal in JIE 2022, where they look at Argentinian wines, and they look at, this is the unit value of exports. So that's the price. And they looked at high quality is higher price. And when you raise the tariffs, you tend to reduce your price, which means that you tend to reduce your markups in terms of the unit values. And the most interesting is that tariffs times quality, which is positive, which is telling you that you have a counteracting effect of quality on tariffs. So I think it's good news in a sense for that specific sector, which is able actually to change quality by investments, or where quality really matters in terms of the adjustments more generally. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop here. This is the set of papers. I forgot the Kim Anderson papers, but it's easy to find online. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thierry. So both something that is pessimistic and something that is optimistic at the end. So we will finish this second round of questions with Cécile Rognoni. So I will ask basically the same question about, with this increased protectionism, what strategies for specific companies like yours, Pernod Ricard, adopt to protect the international competition, and also to ensure continue access to markets. So you have 8 minutes again. Thank you.
I can begin without the slide, it doesn't matter. As we have seen, Donald Trump drives an aggressive trade policy. And in France, we have the same story with the backlash of the, excuse me, it's not a good one. And yes, in France, we have the same story with the backlash against CETA or the rejection with Mercosur. Protectionism is coming back. And the word free trade agreement is almost a taboo. A recent study shows that 67% of French people considers that international trade rules are disadvantageous compared to 16% of German people. The causes, there are a lot of explanation about that. The fear to lose your job due to unfair competition, the desire to protect your agriculture, to produce more in France, and to be less dependent on other countries, and also the will to have a better regulation on health and environmental subjects. At Pernod Ricard, we are convinced that a free trade agreement and international trade are an opportunity. Wine and sector spirit are a good example of the opportunity of international trade. It is one of the key export sectors, with cosmetic, luxury, aerospace, and Pernod Ricard alone generate 11 billion in revenue and support 22,000 jobs, from cellars to vineyards to logistics and distribution. All these jobs are directly linked to the connection between France and the rest of the world. The specificity of our sector is that our product cannot be offshored. Cognac cannot be made in Australia. Champagne cannot be made in Africa. It will be legally impossible and culturally absurd. Cognacs come from cognac. Champagne come from champagne. And all these products comes from specific terroirs, and they are the result of centuries of know-how passed from one generation to the next one. So when you export cognac or champagne, you export a part of your culture, your identity, and your lifestyle. These are the strengths of the sector, but on the other hand, we have to talk about the fragility. And the sector is very fragile because it's exposed geopolitically. The first reason is that our wines and spirits are very visible on the international stage. So when a conflict arises, we become the perfect target. We experienced it with the United States during the dispute with Airbus and Boeing. It has nothing to do with our sector. We had been collateral victim, and 25% of tariff have been imposed. The result, 500 million euros in loss. The wineries were unable to sell their product and their stock because the prices was too high. And the second reason of the fragility is that our sector relies on stable, clear, and predictable rules. But today, there is global regulatory chaos. Rules are shifting. Tariff barriers are re-emerging, and non-tariff barriers are exploding with labeling and also health and social, environmental regulation. Lastly, trade is increasingly used as a political weapon. We see it with USA, which is our first market, and Donald Trump threatened our sector of 200% of tariff. This week, he announced he will decrease it to 10% for the moment. In China, it was the same story. Cognac had been taken in hostage because to respond to the EU investigation about electric vehicle. The result, losses of 50 million euros per month for all the sectors. But last week, a solution has been negotiated. The tariff will be changed in minimum price, and that will minimize the damage. In short, every time there is a new geopolitical conflict, our sector is caught in the crossfire. And of course, we know we have to diversify and don't depend on those markets, but you can't conquer a new market overnight. To enter a country, to develop the organization of the distribution, to build branding awareness, that take 10 or 15 years. And to be honest, the market which have the democratic way and the purchasing power of China or USA are very rare. There is India, but with 150% of tariffs, it is virtually close to foreign product. There is also the Nigeria, which has a good potential, but with the tax increase and the regulatory instability, it makes the things very difficult. So to face all this tension, our one solution, one powerful solution, is a free trade agreement. When it's well negotiated, well implemented, and properly monitored, it can be a powerful tool. And we have seen it with a concrete example with the CETA, the agreement with Canada, which is heavily criticized, just as Mercosur, but the results speak for themselves. Since the signature of the CETA, the export has increased by 33% across all sectors. So it's not only for wine and spirit. Protectionism is expensive. The consequences are immediate: tariff, inflation, slowdown, job losses. And it is a lose-lose logic for everyone. On the other hand, free trade as a win-win logic, elimination of tariff, lower prices for consumer, better competitivity, and job creation. To conclude, for Pernod Ricard, with the tension in our two first markets, we try to do our best to promote and to support free trade agreement. Especially, we will be especially interested by an EU and India free trade agreement, and also by agreement with the Southeast Asian countries, and also with the Mercosur. And to achieve these goals, we need citizens and policymakers to be aware of the benefit of international trade. That's why we work with Charlotte and the CEPII on a report that will highlight agreement by agreement and sector by sector all the benefits for the French economy.
Thank you very much, Cécile. So maybe it's totally, it's not the time to cheer yet because we have 10 minutes for questions. So I will give the floor to the room. If you have any questions, we have, yes, 10 minutes to.
I have a question for Thierry. And my question is, so I think people are a bit surprised by how little imports reacted so far to the Trump tariffs in the US. So import values did not fall as we would expect from our trade models. And I wonder if the quality explanation you gave could explain part of this, because the US might be a high quality consumer. And so maybe we have just underestimated all the elasticities, the general elasticities, or if it's more like an explanation that I picked up from Richard's point about companies just waiting it out for the moment and believing it's just a temporary shock.
So I think we would need some specialists from logistics here and transport, because my feeling is that there's been since people in those companies, they have really big means to try to, and big interest in trying to predict what's going to happen. They knew Trump was serious, and I think they maybe more than governments, they believed it. So they actually front loaded their exports, and there's been this spike. I'm not a full specialist of that, but there's been the spike of exports before those things entered. For sure, for cars, there's been this incredible rush for bringing stuff inside the U.S. Before. So maybe it is the same for agricultural and food products. I don't see why we would see tariff elasticities aggregate being so different from what we've seen with Trump 1 typically. And there's been some studies on that. The average elasticity that I gave you, 2, 3, 4, is stuff that is estimated on tariffs. So it might be larger for small firms, and it might be driven down by high quality, but I think the aggregate is, I don't see it being too different, but maybe it's going to take 1 or 2 years to manifest itself.
I have a question for the professionals in the alcohol sector. Given that alcohol is really a highly symbolic cultural good, I was wondering whether you could describe a bit what happened with the internationalization. Did we see, because in the slides we understood that you had local stars. So over the years, did the premium or the position of those local stars eroded? And we have witnessed an homogenization where in most countries, in fact, the number 1, number 2, and number 3 converged. Okay, is it what happened, or did it remain very segmented? So that's the first question. And the second question relates to more recently. Do we see a change? And notably related to what Kevin was saying, where you see some boycotts. I mean, do we see home buyers kick in, or anti-American brand settle? Is this just a buzz, or does it materialize in data? I mean, it's really out of curiosity. Do we see consumers take power and react to something that is clearly not rational or aggressive? Yes.
Shall I jump in there first? That's a very good question. And we actually, I ran something for work on anti-Americanism back when April the 1st happened, because we've got a company called the Morning Consult who do sort of consumer surveys and all that. And there was a massive jump in anti-Americanism in everywhere apart from Russia, which was positive, which was quite amusing. And we also saw the Canadians being quite vocal in destocking US products in their liquor stores. And I did notice in the trade figures from the US, there has been a drop in bourbon into Canada. Typically, you wouldn't get a straight response from American spirit producers because of the impact that Trump might do on them otherwise. But I'd say it's still early days to talk about that because of the massive overstocks, which are probably keeping prices a lot more consumed than they would otherwise be. On the first question, market, yes. I mean, so it's brilliant that we talked about Yeni Raki because we're 95% Yeni Raki in Turkey. And one of the things about buying a local producer was to get that market access. And actually, the Raki sales are still up there. And in fact, we're now working on expanding sort of Scotch into Turkey. And Turkey's been one of the major economies, but that has taken time. And it's only literally been in the last 4 to 5 years that has really happened. I would give a success of tequila as one of those domestic productions that has been bought and then has been actually globalized. So sometimes when I talk about foreign direct investment, we're not just talking about Scotch being exported all over. We're talking about sort of flows and buying products that we can think will become global players. So in this case, tequila is one of those massive global players where it's still massive in Mexico, but it's huge globally. And sometimes we try and do that with Ipioca, which is still big. Kasasha, trying to talk about the sort of cocktail culture and moving that out. And also, Raki, we try, but it is difficult. But generally, you don't see as much change in those sort of brands as you would do. I hope that helps.
Cécile, do you want to say a word?
Yes. Yes, we observe also a real movement of premiumization because people drink less and less. There is a WHO organization who would like, who have the line of the prohibition for alcohol, for example. And we observe that in France, the consumption of alcohol has been reduced by 60% in 60 years and 26% in 20 years. So our goal is to achieve a movement of premiumization and to sell maybe less, but with the best quality.
Yes.
Yeah, it was Cécile, I think, mentioned there was some sort of a talk of a minimum price deal for drink, I guess. And I think the Europeans have been talking about this with China in terms of electric vehicles also. So I was just wondering, do people see this as a forthcoming? It's like a price version of a voluntary export restraint, I guess, is what it is. So it's a way of keeping the producers relatively happy, especially the high quality, high price producers. And then the consumers will not be so happy, but politically, maybe that doesn't matter so much. I just wonder, what do people think? Do they think this is going to be a trend going forward? And if so, do they think it's positive or negative, given that we're heading for protectionism anyway?
Yes. For us, the possibility to negotiate minimum price to replace the tariff duty had been a very good novelty and a very good opportunity. It has been decided last week. And on the July 5, the definitive duties should be imposed if we hadn't this negotiation and this solution. So it was a very, very good decision for us. The important for Chinese people was not to lose the face. And they had a very, very important pressure of politicians in France. And at one moment, they wanted to go back, but they didn't want it to lose a face and to cancel everything. So the minimum prices was a good solution for them, and also a very good solution for us, because it reduced the tariff, the amount is reduced, and there was also legally consequences about the duty free, because during all the investigation about anti-dumping, our product were not sold in duty free in China, which correspond to 20% of our market, and this solution of minimum price allowed to deblock duty free. So it was very important.
On that, as far as I understood this cognac story, in France, it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs actually that does the trade commerce extérieur policy, oddly enough, for the last 15 years. And Jean-Noël Barrot is now the foreign ministry, and he's a great trade economist. So I think it must be good if he negotiated that. So my view, exactly as you said, is that it is like a voluntary export restraint. So it's coming back, which shows that the goal of the government is really not at all to raise revenues. It's just, we're very happy to transfer the rents to BYD for electric vehicles if they bring only high-end cars. The Chinese government is very happy to transfer the rent to Pernod Ricard, and that's absolutely fine as long as it reduces the volumes and protects the local production. And that's good in terms of the consumer for the quality side, because high quality is good in the utility. Of course, it's not very good for public finance, but those are marginal in the sense. So, given that, I think it's a second best or third best or fourth best thing. Now, the pessimistic view about that is that I don't think Trump really is on that side. I think Trump really wants the revenues he's deluded into the fact that he can get both the jobs and the tariff revenues. And that's, as long as he has the advisors he has, which are really bad trade economists, except Kim Rule, who seems like completely crazy now. I don't see this progressing as long as somebody doesn't tell him you can't have both ways.
Thank you very much. I think we have to stop now. So if you have other questions, we can continue during the meal. So unfortunately, we won't be able to ask questions to Richard. So Richard, we'll think about you. And thank you a lot for being here. So we can make a round of applause for panelists. Thank you very much for being here. And I assume that now we have time for lunch. Thank you very much.